As we continue through the second chapter of Hebrews, keeping up with where we have come from, and then maintaining the most important point that while the audience of this writer is trying to put Jesus in the tradition of the Jews and to therefore remain tied to the Jewish faith, he's trying to convince them that that's a backward direction. You can't go in that direction because Jesus has changed everything. Jesus is different. Jesus is not Moses. Jesus is completely different and has, in that way, changed the trajectory of worship of God, of following God, and that you now have to do it in a different way. You can't rely on the Jewish tradition anymore. You have to rely on what Jesus has done. And so in that line, something you need to know about the argument that he's making. How many messiahs were expected? Everybody is aware of, everybody knows the deliverer king. That's the Messiah that everybody is used to observing in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. But there's actually more to that story. In the time that we are talking about here, in the time of Jesus, and in the couple of centuries before Jesus at least, there was a different expectation, at least in a large group of people who were very much expecting Messiah, only they were expecting messiahs. We know this from several sources, but it is most explicit, it is most easily observed in the Dead Sea Scrolls. But once you're aware of it in the Dead Sea Scrolls, you can see it in this book of Hebrews. And so there is the deliverer king, the one who comes, who is elevated in Israel to be the king of Israel, to rule Israel, and most importantly, to free Israel from its overlords. And in the time that we're talking about, that would be the Romans. In the time this idea develops, it was actually before the Romans. But the idea is that this political king delivers the people and rules over the people. But there's another Messiah alongside the deliverer king, and that is the high priest Messiah, the religious Messiah, if you want to put it in those terms. And he would come and be the representative to God of the people. And the deliverer king and this high priest were not the same person in this idea. It's two completely different people fulfilling two different roles. One as the king on earth and one as the high priest representing the people to God. This is in the Dead Sea Scrolls in several of them. And it was one of the most enlightening things that was found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And we're going to talk about that more as we get a little further, because there's one scroll that is dedicated to this idea and is expressly the same kind of thing that the writer of the book of Hebrews is going to be talking about in the next few chapters once we get that far. But keep this in your mind, that there are actually in several veins of Judaism at the time, there is this dual Messiah. There is a Messiah who is a king and a Messiah who is a high priest, fulfilling two different roles. So to reorient where we are, the beginning of the book, we must pay much closer attention to what we have heard, lest we drift away from it, lest we abandon Jesus as fulfilling the idea of Messiah, even though all of these people he's writing to believed Jesus was Messiah. They accepted him as Messiah. They accepted him as Son of God. They accepted him as different. What they were not there on, what he was trying to get them to remember. With that being the case, what Jesus had brought was not a continuation of the same thing. This is different. Jesus has changed it. So we have to remember that, lest we drift away from that. And if we neglect what happens if we neglect such a great salvation that was first declared by the Lord and was attested to us by those who heard, while God also bore witnesses by signs and wonders and various miracles and by the gifts of the Holy Spirit that had been distributed according to his will. God has proven this through his signs and wonders and miracles, and it was attested to us by those who heard this, that this was a different course. This was not more of the same. So I wanted to kind of encapsulate the entire argument of the chapter as we step through it, so you can have the entire argument in front of you, so you can see the whole argument put together. And it is this: we must not drift from the truth, as we just saw, because our Lord Jesus and our God the Father have clearly confirmed that truth being that God completed the Lord through suffering, which we've talked about a little bit and we'll continue to talk about, that Jesus was completed. Perfected is the way it's often interpreted by the translators, that he was perfected. The problem with that word is it doesn't really convey the idea that the Greek word there conveys. It's the idea of being finished, completed. So God completed Jesus through suffering. This is the truth, which suffering was for all. The Greek word pas, which the writer of the book of Hebrews likes, uses a lot. It's a very common word. It's all through the New Testament, but we see it coming up over and over again. And I'll point to it when we're there because it makes some difference to his argument. The suffering was for all, but to bring many, as he says, sons, to glory. So suffering for all, but bringing many. As such, it was befitting that he passed through death to glory. The completion involved him passing through death to glory, and it was fitting that it be that way because all through fear of death were subject to slavery. He had to follow the same path that we followed. We have to pass through death to get to glory, and we are subject to the slavery of the idea that we pass through death. And this is why it was fitting for him to do the same thing. So there's the expectation for the Messiah, the King Deliverer. Jesus could fulfill that role, being from Israel. And it's argued in several places that being from Judah put him in the line of David, and therefore he could fulfill this role as King Deliverer in the line of David. But there was a role that he could not fulfill, and that was high priest, because he was not of the tribe of Levi. But what his role, the writer here is going to argue, is as brother deliverer, to be one of us and our deliverer, and as that, the high priest who is in charge of offering the deliverance. He's the deliverer, he's the method of deliverance, but he's also the deliverer as the high priest who offers the sacrifice of deliverance. In the position he was before his suffering, he was incapable of being the brother deliverer and high priest. He could be the king deliverer. Anybody could do that job. Anybody from Israel, you could argue anybody from Judah, from the tribe of Judah, of the line of David, could fulfill that. Any ordinary person. But to do what Jesus did, you had to be something else, something more than just in line as the king deliverer. You had to also be this high priest who could make deliverance. Now, these two roles that we're talking about here are visible in the New Testament. As I said, we'll see some of that here in the book of Hebrews. The same idea you see in the book of Revelation, but you don't see it in the way you might expect. But if you remember in the book of Revelation, you have the Antichrist. The Antichrist is a political figure who rules. He would be comparable to what we're talking about here as the Messiah, the King Deliverer. But there was another entity there, another person, to put it that way, who was alongside the Antichrist, the false prophet. The false prophet is fulfilling that second role as the Messiah high priest. So we see that separation of roles there. That's why it's in the book of Revelation. It is a reflection of this idea. And we have to have, therefore, both of these roles fulfilled. And again, this comes from the idea of the Dead Sea Scrolls. There are historic, mostly, interpreters of Jesus, history scholars, who will point to Jesus's teaching and say that you can actually show from Jesus's teaching that he didn't expect to fulfill both roles, that he saw himself as the king deliverer, and that there would be another from God who would be the other deliverer, and that was the Son of Man. That Jesus didn't expect himself to be the Son of Man. He was going to be the Messiah, the ruler, who would rule, but that the Son of Man would provide the connection to God the Father and would be the religious ruler, in effect. And they make this argument because of the way Jesus talks about the Son of Man. If you read through the Gospels, when he talks about the Son of Man, he never calls himself the Son of Man. I, the Son of Man. The Son of Man is always referred to as a third person, in the third person. Now you can say that Jesus was talking about himself in the third person in all of these cases. But for example, when he's talking to the Sanhedrin there during his trial, he says, when they ask if he's the Messiah, he says, I am, and you will see the Son of Man coming. He doesn't say, and you will see me, the Son of Man, coming. And that's the kind of idea here. That's the idea. He always talks about the Son of Man as a third person, and that's why they make that argument. You can argue it both ways, obviously, because that's not the traditional understanding of what Jesus was talking about when he talked about the Son of Man. But this hammers home this idea that there were these two roles of Messiah that many were interpreting as two completely separate people, to put it that way, two separate Messiahs. And that's why we're going to see the two being combined here in the book of Hebrews explicitly, why he goes through that process. But we see him who for a little while was made a little lower than the angels, namely Jesus, crowned with glory and honor because of the suffering of death, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone. He was completed by the suffering of death, and that death was for everyone. Again, Greek word pas. For it was fitting that he, for whom and by whom all things exist, in bringing many sons to glory, should make the founder of their salvation perfect through suffering. Perfect meaning complete, finished. He was unfinished until he suffered. He was the founder. That word is often translated pioneer because it means someone who is going a way that had not been gone before. He was breaking new ground. So Jesus was something different. That word implies this difference, this originality, this uniqueness. Now, the question is going to come up, who is he? It was fitting that he, for whom and by whom all things exist. We need to know who this he is, because as he goes on, we continue in verse 11, for he who sanctifies and those who are sanctified all have one source. We need to know what that one source is. It literally says from one all. So while the word source here I put in italics, as the King James Version and several versions do, when a word isn't really there, it's implied and put in by the translators. What this says is that he who sanctifies and those who are sanctified have one source, but what it literally says is from one, all. All are from one. So all come from one something. What is that something? So it's related back to verse 10. And we're going to try to answer that question because it's not an obvious answer. It could come from two different places because it could be connected to verse 10 or what comes after verse 11. That is why, since the sanctifier and the sanctified are the same, that is why he's not ashamed to call them brothers, saying, I will tell of your name to my brothers in the midst of the congregation. I will sing your praise. And again, I will put my trust in him. And again, behold, I am the children God has given me. We talked about these two quotations last week from Psalms and Isaiah 8. We talked a little bit about Isaiah 7 as the lead up to Isaiah 8. From one all, who is the one that we are all from, including Jesus. Well, the obvious answer, it was fitting from verse 10 that he, and this he is the one, should make the founder perfect through suffering. Now, it can't be Jesus because he made the founder perfect through suffering. So whoever this he is making Jesus something, making Jesus perfect through suffering. So if we're talking about he, it has to be God the Father because he is the one doing these things. But what comes after this also could explain it. Since therefore the children share in flesh and blood, so Jesus shares in flesh and blood, he himself likewise partook of the same things, that through death he might destroy the one who has the power of death, that is, the devil, and deliver all those who through fear of death were subject to lifelong slavery. So sharing the fear of death, he was able to overcome death and therefore defeat it. And then he says in verse 16, for surely it is not angels that he helps, but he helps the offspring of Abraham. Angels don't need help. In other words, angels don't need help because they don't have the fear of death. Angels don't die. So it's not angels that he's helping. So his brothers are not angels. His brothers are the offspring of Abraham. So who is the source that all are one of? Could also be, besides God the Father, Abraham, because we all are from one source. We all are offspring of Abraham. Now, we're not all offspring directly of Abraham. We are all offspring of Adam. And when the writer is using this notion of the offspring of Abraham, he's talking about the offspring of the promise God has made to man. And that promise goes all the way back to Adam. So the writer may be indicating that we all share the same source as Adam. We are all God's creation. We are not all God. Why does this matter? It could go either way. Why does this matter? The idea that we are all of one source from God the Father would mean that the writer's talking about the divine spark. We all have the divine spark in us. We all have a piece of God in us. If you think back to the teachings that you've heard on Gnosticism, when we were talking about Gnosticism, Gnostics tend to believe that idea. We all have a piece of God in us, and the idea of Gnosticism is we are taught, it is revealed to us that we have this spark, which gets us back to that spark, gets us back to God. That is the knowledge we need. So that knowledge that we have this spark of God in us, that is not the way we believe it when we believe in the ultimate corruption, that we are all corrupted through Adam, and that we all can't get back to God because of that corruption, the original sin. There is some conflict there, but he could be teaching that we all have that one source from God. He could also be teaching that we all have that one source in Adam because we all share in flesh and blood, material. Remember, in the Gnostic sense, if you're material, you're bad. And if you're God, spirit, you're good. And you have these two ideas here. Are we all the same because we're all corrupt and bad and material? Are we all the same because we all have the spark of good in us from God? So it matters. So which one did the writer mean? He never tells us explicitly which one he means. That may very well be on purpose because he wants both ideas to be conveyed. Probably not. He probably had one in mind. I think it plays more to his idea, his teaching here, that he's actually talking about Adam, that Jesus shared Adam, that source being that we share being our flesh and blood, and that God the Father couldn't do that. So there's another idea that is not something we think about typically. But if you think about him saying here that Jesus had to be completed, if you think of Jesus as God before the incarnation, then the fact that he became incarnate and became completed, he became more than he was. And he became more than he was because he became flesh and blood. He felt the slavery to death. He died and overcame death. And he's done something God the Father hasn't done. He's completed. That's kind of a weird idea for us because if God is omni-everything, omnipowerful, omnipresent, omniscient, all-knowing, then how could you be more than that? And yet that's kind of where the argument is here. If you think of it in those terms, if Jesus is God and then is completed, he's more than God the Father. I don't want to argue that point. That's not what I'm trying to argue here, but it is an interesting idea that I've always struggled with in this idea of Jesus did something God the Father couldn't do. And yet Jesus was also less than God the Father according to his own indications, his own teachings, while he was incarnate. So we have these ideas all presented here that we don't really have an answer to, but it's helpful to keep these ideas in your head as you go through this book especially, because it does approach these things. It does come up against these ideas. He is not an angel. He's not here to help his brothers, the angels. He's here to help his brothers, the offspring of Abraham. Therefore, he had to be made like his brothers in every respect. Again, the language here does not say Jesus was born a man. It says he was made like his brothers. He was something else and then was made like his brothers. Now, you can argue that the writer had in mind that Jesus was simply a man and then was made more than a man. But the language here doesn't really imply that. The language seems to be making the assumption that Jesus came from something else and was made like his brothers in every respect. Again, all. Greek word pas was made like his brothers in all. What does that mean? He was made like his brothers in everything. Now, here again, we have to break some uncomfortable ground, because if he's going to be just like us, that has some implications, which we are about to run into. So that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest, he had to be made like us in every respect, in the service of God, to make propitiation for the sins of the people. That word propitiation is substitution in essence. He had to, if he was going to take our place for the sins of the people, be our high priest representative, which is what the high priest did. He took the sins of the people into the Holy of Holies and offered sacrifice for them. If he's going to fulfill that role, he has to take our position. He has to be like us in every respect. For because he himself has suffered when tempted, when tested, he is able to help those who are being tempted, being tested. I've said before, I don't like the word tempted as a translation because the word tempt has a negative context to us. When we see the word tempt, it's always in terms of sin. That's the way our brains have kind of hardened on that word in English. The Greek word isn't that. It means to be tested, to have a choice and to make a choice, but to be tested rather than to be tempted with evil necessarily. It simply means to be tested. So Jesus himself suffered when he was tested. He was put in a position to be tested, tempted in suffering. And he was able to help those of us who go through that constantly, who suffer the lifelong slavery to death. That's the emphasis he's making here. So I'm going to leave it there, and we will come back to this idea. We'll pick it up in verse 18. He's going to be talking more about Jesus taking that permanent role as one of us, and in doing so, being tempted, being tested in that role, going through everything we go through in every respect. What does that say about Jesus? Leave some things for us to think about there. When was Jesus God? Because do we believe that Jesus at 3 minutes old was already omnipotent? Was he already omnipotent? Was he already omnipresent? Was he already omniscient? Was he already everything? Because we see evidence in the New Testament that was not the case. One of the clearest indications of that was when he tells his disciples right out, I don't know when the second coming is. And there are other implications in the Gospels of that very nature. Was Jesus walking at 2 days? So he clearly went through the flesh and blood process. That's one of the points of emphasis here in this book, in every respect. What does that mean? And we'll talk about that a little more as we go through as well.